Kia ora e te whānau, and thank you for joining me here in this online space for my presentation. Kia kaha, kia māia, kia manawanui. Moving rights-focused, mana-enhancing, inclusive early childhood education from rhetoric to reality in Aotearoa New Zealand. I was really looking forward to being able to meet in kōrero with people kanohi, ki te kanohi face-to-face in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. But alas, Omicron has dictated it was not to be. And that is not to say that we didn't try, because we tried really hard to be able to be together. And as much as Zoom fatigue is definitely a thing for me, as I'm sure it is for you all as well, I'm still very grateful for the opportunity to be able to participate in this hui, share some of the mahi I've done, learn heaps and dig deep into our shared kaupapa of inclusive education for all. I've pre-recorded my presentation today owing to the fluidity and flux of the Omicron situation, just in case I or someone else in my family ended up getting sick. And I didn't want to let anyone down if that was the case. So for the first part of the presentation, you'll have me offering my whakaaro, my thoughts through this pre-recorded presentation on inclusive pedagogies and ECE for what I plan to be approximately an hour, give or take. And then after that, I'm going to be available live online in real time to kōrero with you, answer any partai, any questions, facilitate discussion and the like, because I think setting aside intentional time to hash out that shared vision and way forward together is just as important mahi as anything I might contribute to you all via the pre-recorded presentation. I think so. Let's see if my blessed computer is going to let me go to the next slide. Alrighty ho, let's do this thing. So before I begin proper, it's only tika or right that I properly introduce myself and the many hats I come here wearing today. You have to excuse me, I keep forgetting where I'm supposed to be looking, even though I've been doing this for 2 years. I still often end up looking in the wrong place. At home in Aotearoa, Dunedin, I have a wonderful husband and 3 children who are now aged 13, 14 and 15. My eldest child, my son Stephen, was diagnosed as autistic when he was 3 years old, and it was our shared experiences of discrimination, marginalisation and exclusion as we navigated his years in early childhood education together that led me, up until then a very content stay-at-home mum, to think to myself, you know, this isn't okay. Maybe I could be, maybe just maybe, I could be the sort of inclusively minded early childhood teacher that tamariki like Stephen deserve and have the right to, and so often don't end up getting. I'm going to go to Teachers College, I resolved. I did have to bide my time and wait until I could be assured that Stephen was safely transitioned to school and was as happy as possible there. But we did get there, and about 6 weeks before my 30th birthday, with children then aged 3, 4 and 5 in tow, you know, I look back now and go, how on earth did I manage to do it? But somehow we found a way through. I started my undergraduate teaching degree at the University of Otago College of Education, South in Canterbury, Chicago, which is where we lived back then. While I did my teacher training, I also learned that I myself was autistic, which was a real revelation to me in a good way. I definitely kept it well on the down low though, for fear the knowledge would be weaponized against me somehow, as I'd seen happen to many of my autistic peers. That's not to say though that I saw being autistic through a deficit lens. I was and am really proud of being autistic, and I encourage that same sort of pride in my son and in all my autistic kin. But it's certainly difficult being your authentic self when it's constantly reinforced to you that the ways in which you perceive and experience the world around you are fundamentally flawed. Therefore, you yourself are inherently broken in some way. I completed my teaching degree 7 years ago now. And while getting my teaching career underway, which was first in an infant and toddler setting, then relieving across various kindergartens, I also began my journey through postgraduate study. quite quickly. First completing a postgraduate diploma in teaching in 2015, then a Master of Education in 2016/17. My developing research interests were strongly guided, probably not surprisingly given some of the introduction to myself I've just given you, by notions of equity and inclusion for all in early childhood settings. My master's research dissertation, for which I received a 2017 NZEI Aotearoa Early Childhood Scholarship, investigated how all members of an early childhood community of practice, so children and adults alike, supported the active participation, inclusion and citizenship of a disabled child and their family. And in early 2017, my family and I moved up sticks and moved from Invercargill to Dunedin, not too far away, but just far enough away for my whānau, they've said, as I'd applied to enter the PhD program offered by the College of Education here and had more than had my fill of study as a distance student. My PhD thesis, which I'm currently undertaking final revisions on, post-oral exams so I can graduate, hopefully in August, which I'm really excited about, has explored the concept of the early childhood learning environment, interrogated who and what it is, and also how it operates in its production of autistic children's active participation in learning. Throughout my PhD, I've continued to teach, mainly as part of the space or supporting parents alongside children's education, infant parenting support program, offered at the Valley Baptist Community Centre here in Aotearoa, Dunedin. That has been an incredible joy to be able to continue to teach, while also engaging in the mahi of research, which I've also really loved. I felt like I've been able to have the best of both worlds. But in addition to teaching in early childhood, I've also had the pleasure of teaching in the tertiary space as a tutor and teacher educator at different times. In addition, something that's a little bit newer, more recent, is supporting equity and inclusion-oriented PLD in local early childhood centres. So yeah, I think while it's definitely fair to say that I come to this kōrero today with you wearing lots of different hats, I can't really separate one from the others. They inform one another and are all centred on the thought of all tamariki realising and practising their right to a high quality, inclusive early childhood education, which is what we're here to kōrero more about. Excuse me, I get very thirsty when I'm talking and getting all animated and excited. Okay, so thinking about mokopuna as rights holders to an inclusive early childhood education, there's a lot of rhetoric and then there's the reality of the situation and you know what's happening. This notion of mokopuna as rights holders to an inclusive early childhood education is reasonably new and can be particularly problematic in practice for if the mokopuna in question have some kind of disability or additional or complex learning needs. The prevalent rhetoric is generally very much in support of the inclusion of diverse learners. The reality, however, as most or all of us will know, is anything but. Talking the talk of inclusion is easy. Anyone can do that. But walking the walk takes commitment that not everyone has had. And we're in the thick of dealing with the consequences of that now and in the past and ongoing. I think there are a number of reasons for this in Aotearoa New Zealand, aside from the othering of diverse learners and disability/diversity/difference in general. These learners are seen as less human, therefore less important, therefore rendering inclusive education for all as a contestable concept. One reason I think is ECE's long and convoluted road to visibility. By this, I mean sitting outside of Aotearoa New Zealand's compulsory education system, as well as being considered a critical first step in a child's journey through the education system. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, I think, when you hear people continue to say stuff like, ECE is just glorified babysitting. Play-based learning is a crock. Children aren't really doing much of any value through play. And early childhood teachers don't necessarily need to be qualified because our under-5s don't need or deserve that, which I'm just going even now hard. Being subject to such thinking can be an especially dangerous place for disabled learners when you add on the Ministry of Education's inclusive rhetoric of all children and young people are engaged and achieved through being present, participating, learning and belonging. While instruments like the New Zealand Disability Strategy, UNCROC and the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, are very much touted as the bedrock of our legal and binding obligations to include all learners, the Ministry's definition of inclusive early childhood education is problematic on several levels. First, inclusion is physical presence in a building is not inclusion, though I've come across many people who believe that it is. Secondly, participation is often construed in the same way as presence. So that is, a disabled child is there in a setting and going through the motions of engagement in a program, not usually designed with them or their learning interests in mind. I argued in a 2017 journal article that I co-authored, which was based on my master's findings, that the sort of participation that we should be thinking about is that which is active in nature, where all children are able to realise an image of themselves and each other as capable, competent, powerful learners and contributors to the world around them. It's active participation is also about all children enjoying responsive reciprocal relationships with each other that value different ways of being, doing and knowing. And active participation is also about where a space where all children are supported to have an equitable voice in decision-making processes about the things that interest and affect them within their early childhood learning environment. All this is underpinned by walking the walk understanding of inclusive education as a fundamental human right in the early childhood setting. That's what all tamariki deserve. And it's also what Te Whānau promises when it sets forth its aspiration that all children should be able to grow up as competent and confident learners and communicators, healthy in mind, body and spirit, secure in their sense of belonging and in the knowledge that they make a valued contribution to society. The aspiration statement is well known by all of us working teaching in the early childhood sector. It talks at some length about inclusive pedagogies within a responsive and respectful local curriculum that in turn recognises and honours the diversity that tamariki and their whānau bring to the table. Te Whānaki's inclusive intent is evident, but a huge number of barriers persist for kai ako as well as tamariki and whānau, especially those that are attitudinal and or systemic in nature, meaning that narratives of marginalisation, disempowerment and exclusion have continued to abound for disabled tamariki and their whānau in Aotearoa New Zealand's ECE settings. You know, I could tell you a story or two or 10 about some of the horrific stuff Stephen and our family were on the receiving end of during our time, during Stephen's time in ECE, but that's not for now. And Te Whānaki's inclusive intent has often gone unfulfilled in a way that tramples on the dignity and mana of disabled tamariki. However, my master's research findings provided me with a potential way forward out of the uneven understandings and practices of inclusion in early childhood, the various barriers that have proliferated, and proposed a way forward that centres the rights of all tamariki to an inclusive early childhood education. So we think about what are inclusive pedagogies in early childhood education before I say too much more. You may yourself have a number of understandings or different perspectives that you bring to this kōrero, this discussion. But for me, we have some of the stuff here that I myself have, encountered and believe in my practice as a teacher and the things that I've discovered as a researcher. We have there a capable image of the child. All of you is welcome here. Young children as very competent agents of inclusion, a pedagogy of deep listening using all the senses. Slow pedagogies, being patient and unhurried in practice, recognising and honouring the expertise of whānau, the 100 languages of children, seeing and valuing children for who they are and what they can do, rather than focusing on who they aren't and what they can't do. Disabled and diverse learners can be the carer as well as the cared for, so not enacting discourses of pity and charity when conceptualising their possibilities and setting forth a course for inclusive teaching and learning, setting the bar high with the expectations for the achievement of disabled learners, and taking an explicit rights rather than needs-based framing to practice. So, when I've shared this mahi and when I've kōreroed with, different kaiako, different whānau, people go, it's beautifully simple. It's hardly rocket science. Yet anecdotal evidence as well as screeds of research all suggest disabled tamariki and their whānau are still too often not enjoying the equitable and inclusive early childhood education that Te Whāriki promises them, and one of the key reasons why I wanted to come and have this kōrero today is, we need to do better because this isn't okay. Yeah. So, introducing here a potential way forward through the māia. I'd like to introduce you to the framework Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna, or a place where all children belong, a framework for realising the right to inclusive early childhood education that I mentioned just before. I've mentioned arose from my master's research findings and was then published in article form, which I co-authored with my master's then PhD supervisor, Dr. Michael Gaffney. 4 repeating themes emerged from my data, which then became the core principles of Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna: powerful learning identities, or mana tuakiri akoranga, pedagogy of participation, or tikanga whaiwaki, a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging, or ahurea kotahitanga, and environment as a third teacher, or whaitua kaiako tuatoru. Each of these principles have different foci in terms of who or what, as you can see, the principle being enacted, the process to enacting that principle, and what the desired outcome of each principle is. So as you can see there, being capable, competent and resilient citizens, unhurried, considered collective engagement and expectations of growth, rights-based participation within a community setting, and spaces that are meaningful for all tamariki, which offer sensory comfort as well as meaningful open-ended exploration through play-based learning. An explicit rights-oriented focus is woven throughout, which supports the orientation of responsive, inclusive pedagogies in practice. Each of the principles also provides a variety of dilemmas, tensions, and or expectations that need to be worked through in order to bring the full potential of each principle to life and supporting inclusive early childhood education for all. Before I get into each principle and what those dilemmas, tensions, and or expectations are, it's important to note that while teachers definitely need to take the lead in terms of setting the pace, this stuff shouldn't just rest on teachers' shoulders alone. Inherent in this mahi is a sense of common responsibility, a shared kaupapa, meaning, everybody in tamariki, whānau, and communities, as well as kaiako. So let's get cracking with the first principle of Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna, powerful learning identities, or mana tuakiri akoranga. So what would be good, as I have this kōrero about the different principles of the framework, is, in preparation for the kōrero that we will have live later, feel free to take any notes and to be able to, things you might want to kōrero with me about later, go for it. And, I would really like to hear any thoughts or pārtai questions that you might have about anything that comes up. So, enacting mana tuakiri akoranga, ensuring all children develop powerful learning identities, is reliant on a variety of practices. The first of these is the image of the child we hold, which Reggio literature, Malaguzzi in particular, speaks so beautifully about, I think. And some of you might be familiar with that. There are a number of early childhood centres around New Zealand quite heavily invested in Reggio philosophies and practices. Similar to Te Whāriki, the image of the child that Reggio philosophy makes visible is a child that's strong, capable, competent, powerful, rich in multiple intelligences, and multiple modes of meaning making of the world around them, with innate dignity and potential. This isn't an image that belongs to the some. This is for all children and demands a presumption of learner competence always. The second practice that's important to enacting mana tuakiri akoranga is contesting special terminology. Special. The use of such language is something we're all familiar with and many are likely to have participated in. Having tacitly accepted special as a given to riding shotgun in a disabled child's journey through the education system. But we can and absolutely should question how special, especially in terminology like special needs, others disabled tamariki and their whānau in harmful ways. This might involve engaging with the concept known as a pedagogy of discomfort. And if you're interested, sorry, I can send you in the direction of helpful literature if you'd like later on. But I encourage us all to go into that space and do the uncomfortable mahi in examining how and why we might have come to use this terminology and what effect it has on the mana of disabled tamariki and their whānau. There are far more appropriate choices of language. Let's find them and use them. The third practice inherent in supporting all tamariki to develop powerful learning identities, according to Tūrangamona Mokopuna, is how we call forth and honour a disabled Tamaiti's 100 languages of communication and meaning making, which again harks back to Reggio philosophy. What's important here is not privileging verbal communication capacity. The ability to verbally communicate is the only legitimate form of communication a disabled Tamaiti might call upon to share what they want or need you to know with you. It's just one of the many ways in which children can and do communicate their thoughts, ideas and knowledge. Just one. Disabled tamariki communicate, as for non-disabled tamariki, in a multitude of ways. But for disabled tamariki, their communication might come through things like AAC, augmentative alternative communication devices, resources, or through non-verbal modes of communication like touch, dance, or stimming. So all of those have a rightful place when considering what, communication and language looks like. Look, listen, my bad, and pay attention. Viewing disabled tamariki as active participants in learning rather than passive recipients of knowledge is similarly important in supporting the development of powerful learning identities. That's the case for all tamariki, of course, but disabled tamariki are especially vulnerable to being construed as empty vessels who are incapable of substantive learning, which, as we know, is patently incorrect. This links into what I was talking about just before regarding presuming competence all the time, always. Assume tamariki can rather than they can't. Take up a credit rather than deficit-based lens of the possibilities and potentials innate to all tamariki, and assume they can and will progress in their learning at a pace that is appropriate for them. And I think I'll no doubt be preaching to the converted here, but a disabled Tamaiti's powerful learning identity is heavily reliant, even more so than a non-disabled Tamaiti, I think, on how Kai Ako honour and value the knowledge and expertise that whānau hold about their disabled tamariki. I know I've been on the receiving end of trying to offer thoughts and ideas as a parent, valuable knowledge that would have positively informed Stephen's experiences of participation and learning in his early childhood setting. But I ended up being shut out of most kōrero because I was just a parent. What did I know? The ways in which his Kai Ako hoarded power and perceived expertise, refusing to share any with me, were really hurtful. I eventually gave up trying to contribute because I knew no one cared to listen to me. This is what we don't want to happen. See the knowledge base that whānau hold about their tamariki as an invaluable asset to your teaching and practice. Tap into it regularly, and please seek to distribute power and expertise as evenly as possible with whānau. And underpinning all this, bringing powerful learning identities to life is contingent on two things. First, authentic respect for the contributions of disabled tamariki. They're alert to when Kai Ako and other adults in their orbit think and feel indifferently about them. find them frustrating and write them off. Disabled tamariki then feel closed down, confronted and constrained, and become detached from what Angus McFarlane, an academic from the University of Canterbury, calls the pumanawanui or pulse or everyday life in their early childhood setting. This then engenders feelings of disempowerment, isolation and shame, which are counter to Te Whāriki's intent that the curriculum recognises and enhances rather than diminishes the rights and mana of tamariki. Second, in bringing powerful learning identities to life, I'd argue, is the ways in which kaha ako and other adults in an early childhood setting make disability visible as a source of pride, identity and recognition. This is an inalienable right of disabled tamariki. Encourage them to live their lives and practice identity work in ways that are meaningful and affirming to them, whatever the diversity is in question. This also includes the ways in which they and or their whānau might choose to identify in terms of their disability. There are two main schools of thought at play here. One is that of person-first language, which many kaha ako are familiar and comfortable with. Person-first language emphasises a person's humanity, which must always precede their disability, and their disability being only a part of rather than the sum total of their personhood. Using person-first language, you describe a tamaiti with a disability as just that, a tamaiti with a disability. The second school of thought at play is that of identity-first language, which is increasingly popular in the disability community, but which many kaha ako, in my experience, are made uncomfortable by. Identity-first language emphasises disability as a fundamental, integral part of someone's identity. Using identity-first language, we shift from tamaiti with a disability to disabled tamaiti. I myself align with this way of thinking and conceptualising disability and call myself autistic woman, autistic student, autistic teacher, so on and so forth. I've also found that when asked, most disabled people are the same, but not all. You must always ask, you can never assume. It is not for kaha ako or anyone else for that matter to decide how disabled people and disabled tamariki choose to identify. We want to be supporting agency and voice in terms of the identity work that disabled tamariki carry out in the everyday of their lives in our early childhood settings, and letting them know this is a space for everyone, however they come to us. Alrighty. On to principle number 2, pedagogy of participation or tikanga whaiwaki. Enacting a pedagogy of participation is similarly multifaceted and is reliant on thought systems oriented towards active participation and inclusion for all being put into action and practice. Or as I sometimes refer to it, walking the walk as well as talking the talk. Right, hold on a sec. A pedagogy of deep listening plays a significant part. So when I say a pedagogy of deep listening, it's one that maybe looks, seems or feels a bit different to that you might have come across before. This pedagogy of deep listening involves not only listening to disabled tamariki and their whānau with intent and respect, and making sure that their contributions to living and learning in your early childhood setting are visible and valued, but also engaging in this dialogue of listening using all your senses, not just that of hearing. Listening in this way demonstrates not only respect for the multimodal communication and meaning making that disabled tamariki often engage in, but it also opens up lots more possibilities for picking up cues and communicative intent via alternative pathways that sometimes tend to be overlooked. It takes time and intent, but is so worth it. Something else enacting a pedagogy of participation asks of everyone participating and living and learning in an early childhood setting, especially kaha ako and other adults, who are usually the ones to set the pace, are respectful, relaxed and unhurried approaches to practice. This is something that all tamariki will respond to well, disabled tamariki especially so. Now I understand that can be actually a really difficult one in practice, the theory is all very good and well of this idea, but in practice, a bit more difficult, as early childhood settings are often frenetically busy places. What I'm suggesting is adopting a calm, relaxed, unhurried attitude to the day in the early childhood setting, trying hard not to get too frustrated about hiccups or areas of potential tension in the day, going with the flow where possible in terms of routines and schedules, especially if it's immediate learning interests that have prompted a potential change, and not hurrying tamariki through any kind of engagement in the program. This is especially important in terms of communication with and for disabled tamariki. And listening to what they're telling you, and like just really thinking hard about what it is rather than just assuming through privileging your own lens of what's going on. Please take the time to actively listen, again, as I've already said, using all your senses, and respond to the communicative efforts of disabled tamariki, however they come, in a kind, gentle and affirmative manner. Viewing young children as powerful agents of inclusion is critical to a pedagogy of participation as well. While it's true that kai ako and other adults within an early childhood setting should absolutely be setting the pace with regard to expectations of inclusive mana enhancing practice, responsibility for this, as I've already alluded to, is all on them. Young children can and do take up roles as agents of inclusion in supporting and facilitating equitable practices in ways that are really quite profound. The key here is for kai ako and other adults to provide time and space for those equitable practices to play out, and not to assume that they as adults automatically possess more power and expertise in enacting inclusion than tamariki do. Adults do, of course, play an important role, but this recognition of this should never be at the expense of acknowledging that what tamariki can do and do. Leadership potential. All tamariki have it if kai ako care to look. A pedagogy of participation, similar to supporting the development of powerful learning identities, is contingent on recognising mana and leadership capacity in disabled tamariki, rather than assuming they can't or don't or won't want to take up leadership roles in the early childhood setting. It will probably go without saying that knowing how to enact or support the development of leadership potential is embedded in knowing you learn as well, and offering opportunities for stretching their leadership potential in ways that are appropriate, relevant and meaningful to them. What have we got next? Right, a pedagogy of participation is grounded, as Te Whāriki alludes to the importance of, in the responsive, respectful, reciprocal relationships disabled tamariki have with the people, places and things that make up their early childhood setting and their early childhood learning environment. Do you know what the important people, places and the things are, what potential each holds, and how they talk to one another in producing the active participation and learning of disabled tamariki in your setting? You may well do. I'm sure that you do, in fact. This sort of approach to practice, or this orientation to practice, is often called an interactive pedagogy, and it requires that people, humans, decenter themselves and their importance, or how they perceive their importance, to make space for the potentials of the inanimate stuff, so the more than human stuff making up the early childhood learning environment, and to think that human and more than human together co-produce the active participation and learning of disabled tamariki. An interactive pedagogy demands that kai ako in particular reconceive of what or who the early childhood learning environment is, and how it operates as human and more than human together. Basically make the active participation and learning of tamariki possible. I don't really have the time or space to go into an interactive pedagogy in too much detail, because I want to make sure I get through the rest of the mahi that I have planned. But I do have a framework for a journal article begging for my attention once I have attended to the final revisions on my thesis, which will hopefully I can get published later this year. I've also written about it in a chapter I had published in the second edition of Te Aotearoa Tataki, Perspectives on Inclusion, Social Justice and Equity from Aotearoa New Zealand, which you might have yourself or be able to get easy access to. If you'd like to look further afield instead of, or as well as, in terms of thinking about the potentials of an interactive pedagogy, I can highly recommend the work of Afrika Taylor, who's based in Australia, and Halevi Lenz Taguchi, who's based in Sweden. We can coordinate more about that later if you'd like, or via email. And I think as well, to round up the kōrero for this principle, setting high expectations for achieving the maximum extent of individual potential, not according to a normative standard, is also inherent in putting a pedagogy of participation into practice. Encourage disabled tamariki to aim high, while remembering that they're individuals on their own learning journeys, as for non-disabled tamariki. When you know your learners really well, you know that what you can expect of them in terms of their learning, and you're also readily able to identify opportunities to stretch and grow their learning potential. Disabled tamariki, as for lots of my kōrero, you know that they aren't apart from the start. They have just as much right and just as much competence and potential to, you know, get things moving, get things going, get some beautiful learning going. They need trusted adults to show faith in them, sensitively guide them on their way, and celebrate their successes with them. So that is tikanga whaiwahi, pedagogy of participation. So we'll rock on to the next principle, being culture of inclusive contribution and belonging, or ahurea kotahitanga. So I think supporting the development of a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging, ahurea kotahitanga. These names, as the te reo name of the framework and the names for the different principles of the framework, were gifted to Michael and I by a kaitahu kuia, who's a dear family friend of mine. Supporting the development of a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging is likely to be a familiar concept for many of you, and I've no doubt you've got your own thoughts, ideas, and evidence embedded in practice as to, you know, how to get this culture moving. I have some offerings that might align with what you already know, or, you know, maybe they might provide some useful food for thought in terms of enacting alternative ways of being, doing, and knowing within your practice, so far as supporting the growth of inclusive cultures in our early childhood settings. So I think the first of my whakaaro, my thoughts, is that while rights-oriented approaches to practice are well-grounded in how many of us understand inclusive education, UNCROC and the UNCRPD as rights instruments Aotearoa New Zealanders signed up to aren't necessarily well known and thus practiced in our early childhood settings. While I've seen various levels of attention paid to UNCROC in early childhood settings, I've spent time teaching in and doing research in, the UNCRPD has been invisible in all of them. Many of the kaiako I've spoken to didn't even know the UNCRPD existed. The same can be said for the New Zealand Disability Strategy, I actually think, as well. I believe if we're as serious about rights-oriented practices we claim to be, then we need to be making these instruments much more explicit across our practice, including in the ways we plan for and assess learning. However, how this might be achieved, I have some ideas, but, you know, I would absolutely be very, very keen to hear your own ideas about walking the walk of rights-oriented practice here in Aotearoa New Zealand. The second whakaaro I have about supporting the development of a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging in early childhood settings is the need to, as I've just said, walk the walk, not just talk the talk, of the agency disabled tamariki possess and exercise in decision-making about the things that interest and affect them in their early childhood settings. They have voices, however they come, as we've already discussed. Please don't pay their contributions lip service. Act on the contributions disabled tamariki make, render their contributions visible and meaningful, partner with disabled tamariki and bringing their vision of a good life and how they wish to achieve it to life. These are fundamental human rights. Let's make them happen. You know, as well as these whakaaro, these thoughts, safety, security, and trust as fundamental building blocks for participation and learning of critical importance when fostering a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging. The literature on emotional regulation, which you may have come across, will tell you that before a tamaiti is able to meaningfully participate and learn in any kind of education setting, so in early childhood as well as everywhere else, they must first feel like they can trust the setting, that they're safe there and that they belong there. These are fundamental building blocks that are often missing for disabled tamariki, who are often made to feel, to suppress, the authentic selves, are close to invisible in many centre environments. And, you know, these disabled tamariki feel like they can't always trust the people, places and things of the centre environment because of past experiences of fear, shame, disempowerment, marginalisation and exclusion. Without these building blocks in place, disabled tamariki tend to dwell at the very outer margins and worse beyond being meaningfully engaged in sustained learning. This is counter to Te Whāriki's intent that ECE settings be safe and secure places where each child is treated with respect and is accepted for who they are. We need to get these building blocks well in place right from the outset, from a time a disabled tamaiti and their whānau come into our centre and join its community. Again, this harks back to the relationships, the partnerships that we build with disabled tamariki and their whānau. We need to get to know what supports them to trust, how safety is measured for them, what a sense of belonging looks and feels like for them, and make that happen. Finally, I think implicit in supporting the development of a culture of inclusive contribution and belonging is a sense of shared responsibility, or thinking everybody in, for inclusive practices that enable disabled tamariki and their whānau to trust, to feel safe and secure and like they belong and have a place. As I've touched on earlier, this responsibility is carried by everyone, or should be carried by everyone in an early childhood setting. Kaiako need to set the pace, as it were, but every person living and learning in an early childhood setting, including tamariki, have an invaluable role to play in supporting and sustaining inclusive practices. The key task then, my research bore out, is to make sure that everyone in your early childhood setting is on the same page in terms of the what's, whys and hows of enacting inclusive practice. Again, remember the incredible potential of disabled tamariki, as for all tamariki, to carry out this mahi. Alrighty then, Ātena. We've reached the fourth and final principle of tūranga mōna mokopuna, which is environment as a third teacher, or whaitua kaiaku tuatoru. You might be familiar with this notion as for the 100 languages of children and a pedagogy of listening from Reggio Emilia philosophy. What this principle argues is that the early childhood learning environment has immense potential to support the participation and learning of tamariki, and thus to be inclusive, it needs to reflect the ideas, values, cultures, and meaning making of the people who participate in living and learning within it. So for the purposes of our kōrero here today, about the experiences of disabled tamariki within our early childhood settings and how can they be more inclusive in response to that diversity, I'm not just talking about stuff like, is the work of tamariki visible on the walls? What I'm meaning is, does the physical footprint and the layout and the organisation of the centre environment work for disabled tamariki? Is there enough room for them to move around as their embodied meaning making dictates without crashing into someone or something? Are there quiet spaces they can retreat to when the world gets a bit much? Does the learning environment afford privacy if desired or required? Does it afford opportunities for collaboration and for open-ended meaning making? Can disabled tamariki do for themselves as much as is possible? You know, does the learning environment support independence? As a thought of the democratic learning, early childhood learning environment, so for children, by children, visible, or is the learning environment designed and oriented more with ease for adults in mind, as is often the case? Do the aesthetics of the early childhood learning environment speak to the disabled tamariti's modes of meaning making in a way that elicits joy, excitement, and pleasure? How does the learning environment speak to disabled tamariki and invite them to engage in play and learning? You know, are we thinking about the potentialities of sensory dimensions of the learning environment and the immense impact that things like carefully considering noise, lights, smells, and textures can have on the sense of security, safety, and belonging disabled tamariki experience? You know, and thinking about as well how that in turn influences what disabled tamariki are or aren't able to actively, the ways in which they are or aren't able to actively participate and learn. Te whāriki asks that Ohu Ako ensure that the whole of the learning environment is accessible to all tamariki, and recognising the immense potential the learning environment possesses and exercises in supporting, and as we'll all know, sometimes constraining participation and learning for tamariki. However, in my teaching, for what it's worth, in my teaching and research experience, I'm not convinced Ohu Ako always do this. That is, ensuring the whole of the learning environment is accessible to all tamariki. There are a number of reasons why I think, including I don't know how, I'm too afraid or whakama, embarrassed to ask, it's not my problem, it's too hard, and so on and so forth. But I'd encourage you to really think with deep intention about the power of the early childhood learning environment as a third teacher for disabled tamariki, as for all tamariki. It's a matter of professional obligation. Getting the learning environment right is important beyond practice with infants and toddlers, which is where a lot of detailed advice about learning environments in early childhood settings stops. It's also a matter of enacting rights with and for disabled tamariki. So, it just has massive potentials, and I think early childhood kaiako and early childhood communities really need to consider expanding their conceptions of the possibilities bound up in participation and learning within the early childhood learning environment. Is, you know, a matter of critical importance. All right, we're nearly getting there. So with regards to rights-focused, mana-enhancing approaches to inclusive early childhood education, the framework that I've offered, Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna, argues that when a meaningful and inviting learning environment has been made available, within which the practices are based on a culture of rights and inclusive belonging and contribution, and people adopt a pedagogy of participation, promoting engagement and growth, then a learner's identity reflects confident, competent, and resilient citizenship. I acknowledge that these sorts of approaches aren't easily mandated by policy and could probably be described as moral and or ethical approaches to inclusion embedded in social justice. However, I still think they're worth pursuing with intent, with passion, and with vigour. Disabled tamariki deserve to and have the right to have Te Whāriki's promise to them fulfilled. And Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna offers a means by which to help us fulfil that promise. Ultimately, though, I think amongst this kaupapa is the understanding that what works for and is best for disabled tamariki actually works for and is best for all tamariki. The inclusive pedagogy is woven throughout Tūranga Mōna Mokopuna. They aren't about special education, they're about inclusive education, grounded in rights and for everyone. We know better, so we need to be doing better, starting now as we take up the wedo and begin making transformative change all over the motu. So in terms of the pre-recorded kōrero, I'm going to finish up now, and on Monday the 28th, I will be online to continue the kōrero kanohi, ki te kanohi in the online space with you all. So thank you very much. Ka kite.